All right, everyone, welcome. I'm Bruce McConnell, president of the EastWest Institute, and I want to welcome all of you to this event. We have a variety of distinguished guests and speakers and many distinguished participants as well. So we're looking forward for a good, if brief, conversation. We have from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, a great team led by Ambassador Malloy, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later, as well as Advocate Mashabane, who is the South African representative to the UN Group of Governmental Experts. From the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Netherlands, we have Ambassador Nathalie Jaarsma, who is the Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber, and Ambassador Han Pieter, who is the Ambassador of the Netherlands to South Africa, and an amazing team who has helped pull this together, led by Lengu. From Research ICT Africa, which is EastWest's Institute's partner, we have Dr. Alison Gilwald, Executive Director, and Enrico Calandro, Senior Research Associate, who've been helping put this together with all of our team. There are a number of other VIPs who are coming. You've seen Chris Painter, who is known to everyone in the international cyberspace and now heads the GFCE Foundation. Also with us on the registration list, I'm not sure if she's arrived yet, is Kate Gatau, the CEO of ICT Kenya, and Kalim Amadou Sami, head of CERT MU in Mauritius, and who is also a representative to the UN Group of Governmental Experts. Let me go over the normal housekeeping notes before we get started. Keep your microphones muted if you are not speaking. We are, as you know, under the Chatham House rule. There's only one Chatham House rule, and the basic idea is that we will be recording the session, and the speaker remarks will be distributed publicly after the event, but the Q&A and discussion portions of the meeting will not be distributed. They'll be held under the Chatham House rule, which means that you can talk about what happened at the meeting, but not who said it. Good, thank you. I'll go over the agenda now. We'll start out with some opening messages and then get right into the conversations. We have 3 pillars. I'll bring those up as we go along here. And so we start with sustainable development and its relationship to ICTs, then discussion about peace and security, about internet and ICT governance, and finally Enrico will pull it together with some rapporteur type summary and other observations. Okay. This meeting reflects the commitment between South Africa and the Netherlands to cooperate on improving cyber stability, and it's also part of a larger project that the EastWest Institute is undertaking in concert with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, which seeks to convene regional cyber dialogue to address regional cyber challenges and capacity building needs. This is the second virtual regional dialogue we've held as part of this project. We held the first meeting focused on Southeast Asia in August. Our South African partners joined us for that meeting, and some of our partners from Singapore, including Val Toon and Shashi Jayukumar, are here today to facilitate and participate in the cross-regional conversations. So we think this will improve the results of the UN process by building more participation and enable stronger local relationships and international relationships and better cooperation. Obviously, we're meeting not in person, but we are planning on having physical meetings in 2021, and one of those will be in Pretoria, which we're very much looking forward to. All right, to get right into it, I want to start off to hear from Ambassador Malloy, the Acting Deputy Director General of the Global Governance and Continental Agenda from DIRCO in South Africa. He was not able to join us physically or even in person at the moment, but is able to join us by some recorded remarks. And so roll the tape.
Good day to you all, my dear colleagues and friends who have joined us on this platform. Ambassador Han Peters, my dear colleague, Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to South Africa, Ambassador Nathalie Jaarsma, Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber, and all our friends from the Netherlands, Mr. Bruce McConnell, President of EastWest Institute, Adjunct Professor Alison Gilwald from Research ICT Africa, distinguished panel members and Southern African cyber experts. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Bruce McConnell for welcoming us all to this important virtual policy dialogue and to express my gratitude for his kind words. On behalf of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Government of South Africa, we wish to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands for co-hosting this virtual Southern Africa Global Cyber Policy Dialogue and the EastWest Institute and Research ICT Africa for partnering with us in this effort. We are meeting at the initiative of the Foreign Ministers of South Africa and the Netherlands, and partnering with Research ICT Africa and the EastWest Institute to initiate a discussion amongst the Southern African cyber experts. This is part of a series of regional roundtables on cyber issues convened by the Dutch Foreign Ministry and the EastWest Institute. It is our hope that this virtual format, which has been necessitated by the advent of COVID-19 pandemic, will generate interest and momentum towards a face-to-face meeting for Southern African cyber experts to be hosted in South Africa next year. Ladies and gentlemen, when Minister Dr. Pandor and her Dutch counterpart, Mr. Stef Blok, met in February of this year, they underscored the importance of closer cooperation to develop international consensus for action to ensure stability of the cyberspace. Our countries share a determination to contribute towards the progressive development of international law, norms, standards, and values, so that the global challenges and opportunities of the cyber realm may be addressed collectively and multilaterally with the United Nations at the center. We are meeting today to take this work forward, focusing on the promotion of awareness on the cyber matters, particularly in the areas of peace and security, governance, as well as the overarching sustainable development aspects. We wish to draw from the wealth of knowledge and expertise that exists in this region. It is for this reason that we have in our midst multidisciplinary speakers and experts and a mix of cyber policy developers and practitioners. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of South Africa shares the view that cyber, its benefits and threats, cannot be viewed separately from global peace and sustainable development endeavors. In line with our global commitments to achieving the sustainable development goals, any discussion around digitalization in the Southern African region needs to take place within this context first, and also within the context of accessibility and usability. The reality we face is that in a region of stark inequalities, where we may have pockets of cyber excellence and key experts, we are still far from realizing what the Internet Governance Forum correctly characterizes as a basic need for all peoples to access the possibilities of the cyber world. The overriding priority, therefore, has to be to secure access and usability to positively impact the day-to-day lives of our people and drive forward the sustainable development of local communities. President Ramaphosa is a strong advocate in this regard. when he addressed the students at the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa in June last year. He encouraged the use of cyber technologies to address the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. The president further underscored the opportunity by saying, and I want to quote here, "With the fourth industrial revolution, we are going to be early adopters and we are going to be ahead," close quote. We trust that today's virtual meeting, therefore, will reinforce the need to develop technological and digital literacy while putting security measures in place. This is a shared responsibility that should be taken up by governments, by the private sector, and by civil society. Governments should build the requisite state capacity to safeguard technological infrastructure to protect the citizens from attack and insecurity. The private sector and research institutions should drive the development and deployment of the technological solutions required. Our region will no doubt benefit from international support and partnership to realize its full potential in this area. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by reminding us all that in our commitments to achieve the SDGs, it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we harness the developmental potential of the cyber realm and reap the cyber security dividends. Security and development need to go hand in hand, and therefore it is incumbent on all members of the United Nations, our region included, to remain engaged in the existing governance mechanisms in the UN that seek to strengthen existing partnerships and build new ones that can further transcend national, regional, and continental boundaries. I thank you all for your kind attention and wish all of us the best in our deliberations today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Welcome again. In today's meeting, we have a wide variety of representatives, including many government representatives from more than a dozen countries. But cyberspace and the internet is a multi-stakeholder space. And so it's now my pleasure to invite our civil society partner, Alison Gilwald, Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, to give remarks. Alison?
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you and to partner with you on this. I just wanted to clarify, because the adjunct professorship was mentioned by Ambassador Molloy, that is at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. A lot of the research that Enrico and I will be talking about has been done through Research ICT Africa, of which I'm the executive director, which is an African-based, an African think tank based in Cape Town, working very closely on cyber policy with regional economic communities across the continent, with the African Union, of course, with UNECA, and with various governments as well, and development banks. But let me not take up my precious time. Let me get straight onto the subject at hand. It's so nice to see technical issues of cybersecurity, data protection, and these important governance issues really addressed in the context of developing countries. Often the best practice models, or sort of cut and paste from very different environments, mature markets, mature competitive markets, institutionally endowed countries, and then attempted to be implemented in countries that really don't have the resources to do that. So this is really an important part of Africa's increased participation in these global debates to ensure that the global policies and the global governance really are able to address local needs. But I wanted to just really build on what Ambassador Molloy had said about, the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns, particularly that were introduced to stop the spread of the virus, really have brought into sharp relief the implications of digital inequality for access to life opportunities, to livelihoods, and even survival, as we've seen. We have long known that digital inequality simply reflects the underlying structural inequality in our country and across the continent and between countries. But what the pandemic has highlighted is the compounding effect of digital inequality, as those who are unconnected are unable to mitigate the economic and social impacts of the lockdown through digital substitution. It is only a relatively small elite in Africa, and even in South Africa, where despite having the highest internet penetration in sub-Saharan Africa, nearly half the population still remain offline, have been able to move their work, their education, their banking, or their food order and security online. The vast majority of publicly schooled children have lost a scholastic year because of digital strategies over the past decade, focusing on connecting schools rather than scholars. Other than a few remarkable exceptions, most companies have been unable to pivot to online production or distribution, and nearly 3 million formal jobs are estimated to have been lost in South Africa alone. In the informal sector, the survivalist economy, of whom only 17% are online in South Africa from our After Access 2018 survey, value chains have been ruptured by the lockdown, preventing the vast informal sector in the global South from serving as the usual buffer to these kinds of exogenous shocks, and in many countries producing a major food security hazard. But digital inequality is no longer simply about connectivity as it was when we spoke of the digital divide and connecting the last billion to voice and basic broadband. It's far more now. Digital inequality is really not only between the inequalities between those offline and online, but also those who are barely online, passively consuming expensive communication services, possibly some mobile services, and those who have the technical and financial resources to use these services proactively, to consume them proactively, reduce their transaction costs, and even use digital and data services to produce and to contribute to the prosperity of nations. The digital inequality paradox, as we call it, is one of the wickedest policy problems facing countries today, as the solutions no longer lie in simply infrastructure and services. The modeling of our user survey data shows that the primary determinant of access to internet is education and the corollary indicator of income. Therefore, women and men of a similar income and education in South Africa use the internet in a very similar way. It's that women are concentrated, particularly rural women, amongst those who have no education and therefore access to the internet. So access to the internet is very much an issue of the poor. It's also the survey also revealed that only tertiary level respondents were sufficiently aware of cybersecurity and data protection issues to be able to protect themselves to some degree. So the demand side policy interventions required represent classical human development challenges through the course of quality education. And though of course we need quality education and the alignment with digital economy needs, are essential, and that is not just coding, to emphasize. This highlights the urgent need for us to move away from the sector siloed policies to transversal national digital policies that will provide the necessary coordination across the public sector and between the public and private sector and civil society to harness the benefits of these technologies in a more equitable way than has been done in the past, and to prevent these harms and to mitigate risks. National development plans and policies that acknowledge the central role of increasingly globalized digital public goods as critical inputs and outputs of modern economies and as key enablers of economic transformation under the right conditions will be critical to economic recovery and of developing countries in a post-COVID situation. And building more, and more importantly, building more inclusive and equitable social compacts post-COVID. As the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, said at this year's Nelson Mandela Lecture on tackling the inequality pandemic, they are looking to the future. There are two seismic shifts that will shape the 21st century, the climate crisis and digital transformation. Both of these can widen inequalities even further and are likely to, unless we set in motion a set of very particular interventions. Calling for a new social contract for a new era that would enable young people to live with dignity, will ensure women have the same prospects and opportunities as men, and will protect the sick and vulnerable and minorities of all kinds, He said, education and digital technology must be the two great enablers and equalizers. To a large extent, the ability of countries to leverage these benefits, the benefits that are anticipated with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, for economic reconstruction and development, will be highly dependent on the degree of their digital readiness. This means not only the infrastructure and services that are often referred to in readiness reports, but for the digitalization of customs and trade and taxation services, but also their cybersecurity and data protection frameworks, that it will be essential to creating the trusted environments required for e-commerce, digital trade, and also digitalized ordinary goods and products. The increasingly complex and adaptive global information system and the processes of digitalization and datafication that are driving it at present, however, cannot be dealt with at the national level alone. African perspectives are necessary to inform global governance on what was recently described as the latest civilizational challenge, that of organizing billions of people around the world within a highly complex and adaptive system through global collaboration on the basis of general principles and norms that will accommodate the greatest diversity. That was Mr. de Chapelle of the Internet and Governance group. It's necessary because development drives to rapidly increase digital inclusion do not often fully consider the full range of digital risks, and some of which emerge from digital inequalities and reality around the continent. The rise of internet as a global public good underpinning global trade, financial and flows requires new forms of global cooperation. It requires developing countries to navigate, developing countries who are often invisible in the development of global governance systems, to navigate the complementary and competing systems of governance, ranging from nation state-based multilateral systems, with which we're more familiar, and that have traditionally governed global governance, to new multi-stakeholder formations, accommodating state, private sector, and civil society interests, to new forms of private authority, both commercial and non-commercial, such as ICANN, for example, with the governance of the technical governance of the internet. The shift in traditional power relations between states and markets and citizens in global governance has blurred notions of international and national and what constitutes public and private. After several decades of private interests dominating evolving governance, public regulation of the internet and specifically platforms has re-emerged. The unrestrained rise of monopolistic global platforms producing massive amounts of private data, which has been commodified with little regard for social and negative implications for the data subjects, has now had a tangible negative impact on issues as far-ranging as national elections. Ideas reflected in global governance, new forms of public, are best understood as practices or communities of practice distinct from traditional notions of public. This has produced normative dilemmas that have both challenged and reinforced liberal democratic norms of global governance, but have also been reconstituted in other parts of the world and are highly contested at the moment. Nevertheless, despite these new forms of public, which may fill public interest mandates, the state continues to have a critical enabling role. The arising question is how African states can better locate themselves in global governance processes, not only to ensure better outcomes and its diverse interests, but to more actively do so in setting global agendas, not just receiving them and engaging with them and contesting them. Understanding the internet as an impure global public good that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable essential service reveals other interests in Africa and other developing regions acquiring global governance capacity. This is because the internet, or good governance of it, that is cybersecurity as a public good, data protection, for example, only emerge in a considerable measure to the extent to which countries can help reproduce them at the national level. Something like cybersecurity is as strong as the weakest link at the global level. Meetings such as these demonstrate the importance of this to mature governments or developing countries, developed economies governments, and particularly the departments of international affairs. who respond to the internet as a strategic good, which can only be defended through the implementation at the national level in all countries, including developing countries, often through a quite imperfect global governance consensus. From a developing country public policy perspective, understanding the implications of these developments in terms of public goods, global public goods, provides points of policy intervention. This can enable the delivery of global public goods, such as the internet, and good governance through public, private, and civil society interplays in an equitable and public interested manner. To understand how governments might enable the realization of global public goods at the national level, we've been drawing on a lot of literature around demand side valuation of public goods instead of only the commercial supply side public valuation of public goods that we see in economic regulation, granting of spectrum, those kinds of things. So we really need a lot more policy experimentation if we're going to shift from the rhetoric of digital equality to the realization of it. An economic policy or international policy that acknowledges the central role of increasingly globalized digital public goods as critical inputs and outputs of modern economies and as key enablers of economic transformation under the right policy conditions will be critical to the economic reconstruction of developing countries post-COVID-19 and in building more inclusive and equitable social compacts going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. What a great layout of the multiple issues that interconnect with each other, ranging from the inequality pandemic to the global monopolistic platforms and the erosion of international norms of global governance, and not only in cyberspace where they don't really exist, but in regular space, in diplomacy, in international relations, and the interaction between cyberspace and some of those trends. Fascinating set of conversations to be had, and certainly relevant to today's meeting. So thank you for that great introduction. I want to turn now to the first of three discussion topics that we are going to cover with your help, with all of your help. So the first one is about, we roll right into it from the opening remarks, sustainable development, and how, as clear to everyone in this call, that it cannot be separated from issues such as accessibility and usability, as Ambassador Malloy said. So we'll have two short interventions, and then there'll be some time for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and that'll be great. And if we don't get questions in the chat, then we will make some questions up. We have questions, or you can raise your hands during the discussion part. So I want to start out with Esther Mwema, founder and chief strategist of Digital Grassroots, to kick off this discussion section. The floor is yours, Esther.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Good afternoon, distinguished guests. I'm happy to be presenting on sustainable development in this global cyber policy dialogue for Southern Africa. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Esther Mwema, joining you from Zambia. I am an open internet for democracy leader and founder and chief strategist at Digital Grassroots. My expert interests are in gender and digital inequalities respectively, something I continue to work towards as an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity based at the London School of Economics. My perspective today comes from a strong civil society background while drawing on my expertise in internet governance and safety. So COVID-19 has amplified the demand to bridge the digital divide in our region. This has resulted in rapid digitization efforts to keep the economy afloat, especially in urban areas. The increase in mobile phone ownership in both rural and urban areas has increased internet penetration as the populace use phones to access the internet. We have therefore seen a strengthening of these voices demanding equality and equity and regional solidarity in the feminist movement through social media. Digital innovation is creating opportunities for social mobility for young people and women who are faced with high unemployment and a tough economy. This gives young people and women autonomy to shape their digital future. And based on my work on the communique of youth resolutions in internet governance by digital grassroots, these are the priority needs of young people to achieve sustainable development. And the first one is skills training. This includes the promotion of the internet as an economic tool for SMEs. There's also a strong demand for mentorship of young people to succeed in the future of jobs. The second one is building adequate infrastructure. We need to improve internet bandwidth, especially in remote areas, reduce the cost of accessing the internet, and strengthen competition policies to discourage monopoly by corporations that prioritize profit over development. The third one is respect for privacy and internet freedom. This calls for multilateral and democratic participation for internet advancement, and also the finalization of IT copyright and cybercrime laws. So this was the perspective of young people, and now I'll look at the perspective of women for sustainable development, and I'll be drawing from my work for the safety report by Safety Health Foundation. And for women, the priorities are safety online, psychosocial and emotional consequences of women participating online include cyberbullying, revenge porn, reduced self-confidence, which impedes good governance and development because it blocks equal participation of women online. Also, there's need for responsive legal processes. ISPs are showing limited capacity and mechanisms to limit illicit content and cyberbullying online. The law is slow in keeping up with technology and online movements. Furthermore, the rise of digital media ties into human trafficking because of the rise in pornography or access to it. Thus, legal systems have to be able to adapt to these new forms of abuse online. A third priority is disaggregated research. Women face nuanced challenges in a patriarchal society that could include access to electricity, lack of clean water or sanitation, and care duties. Offline experiences shape women's online experiences, and the lack of disaggregated data means that research can inappropriately conform to idealized impressions of masculinity and femininity. And furthermore, based on my experience, I would also like to remind our policymakers and implementers of the specific challenges that young people who are not in education or employment and persons living with disabilities and LGBTQ persons face in joining the digital economy. Accessibility for all must also include accessing the internet in one's local language. And some examples of recipient-led needs-based and inclusive capacity building models include my own organization, Digital Grassroots, that works with young people to increase digital citizenship. Then there's the Internet Governance Forum and NRIs, and there's also Mozilla Open Leaders, which helps young people learn how to use their skills and open leadership for a healthy internet, as well as other allies and stakeholders. In conclusion, I'll highlight 3 priorities based on the needs on the ground. The first one is keep the internet on. Freedom of speech must be protected. Governments that shut down the internet or breach citizens' privacy need to be held to account. Build infrastructure in rural areas and provide free internet in public spaces. Second, invest in grassroots. Invest in organizations and young local leaders. The outdated funding model creates gatekeepers and prevents local innovation, risk-taking, and autonomy in the process of building our digital future. Third, but not last, we need to disaggregate the data and policies. It is necessary to understand the specific needs and challenges of the marginalized in the cyber world. We need to engage in critical dialogue with local feminist groups and those working with the disenfranchised through action research and programs to ensure policies meet the needs on the ground. Our commitment is to ensure that cyber policies and implementations do not reproduce inequalities and that no one is left behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you specifically for those final policy exhortations. I love this, keep the internet on, meaning not only that it's on for everybody and not shutting it down, when there's crises and things like that, which has happened in some places, as we know, investing in the grassroots, as Allison said, through education as well as technology, and then making sure that data and the policies are, fit fit every different kind of population. So really great set of ideas for us to think about and discuss. With that, now I'd like to turn over for our second intervention here in this sustainable development discussion. And we have Susan Potgieter, Head of Strategic Services of the South African Banking Risk Information Center, SABRIC, private sector representative, to give remarks. The floor is yours, Susan.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests, and thank you so much to the organizers for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I sincerely believe, and as it has already been said and alluded to by previous speakers, that there's never been a better time to explore partnerships between governments and the private sector in order to strengthen resilience, not only in our region, but also, and I'm talking about cyber resilience, of course, not only in our region, but globally. The pandemic has really taught us lots of valuable lessons, and or I suppose what the one that's at the forefront for me is how quickly people can actually learn to use the internet and to work remotely. And this momentum that we now have in this space can really be maximized should we all pull together and top it up with some good cybersecurity lessons learned and take the drive forward. We really need to envisage and build the future together, tapping into all available expertise and experience to achieve our national sustainable development goals. And of course, whilst technology is a great enabler, it also brings with it cybercrime risk. And those risks are very real for citizens, business, as well as governments. That is why creating cyber resilience must be everybody's responsibility. And tackling it collectively really has lots of benefits to it. I'm hoping to share with you a couple of examples of what we've achieved and done in South Africa, time permitting. And I want to start by just mentioning that I come from the private sector and specifically the banking sector, and the financial services sector is known to optimize technology, especially in their strategy to achieve financial inclusion goals. And it's no secret that digital products are by far dominating innovation in our sector. In South Africa, mobile phones have become banks, and fintechs are disrupting traditional business models across a couple of sectors, not only the financial services sector. And as I've alluded to, with the good comes the bad, unfortunately. And the Internet of Things has inherent risks to it. And without proper risk management, the attack surface has increased exponentially to the benefit of cyber criminals. And we need to keep that in mind. Access to the internet must be balanced with education and access to affordable technical support. And this is something that I feel quite passionate about. It's no good giving access to internet and having very robust policies to bring the net to everybody in a country if you don't balance it with knowledge for people to protect themselves. You literally could be throwing people to the wolves if you don't have that balance in place. And also the cost of the protection is something that we need to also think about. Downloading an update on your mobile phone, if it's going to eat the last of your data, is not a difficult choice for somebody who can't afford it. They will literally have to turn off that upload, and then they're not protected. So we really need to keep that in mind as well. It's also no secret that the private sector is excellent at innovation, analytics, and risk management. And from a security perspective, cybersecurity perspective, business also employs the best practitioners that they can afford. That's become the way to do business these days. As custodians of the economy, the private sector is further well invested in creating cyber resilience within their businesses. And if this expertise is mobilized, it can really expedite national efforts to create cyber resilience at national level as well. And this is why I want to leave with you the thought of exploiting and using public-private partnerships to really expedite the journey and to do things collectively, so that you have the buy-in up front and also have the expertise reach beyond the economic sector into government as well. Governments, on the other hand, have the authority to create legislation and regulation to protect national interests as well as citizens, and in so doing, hopefully create confidence in e-commerce and build trust in the secure use of ICT. And that's all good. I really believe that there's room for national policies and for rules and regulations around within the cyber domain. And I think also that if we work at this together, we will be able to come up with fit for purpose standards and also keep the cost real from a compliance perspective. And that's something that I think should be top of mind, because if you don't balance those imperatives, then you won't have a harmonious situation and balance down the line that will be in the national interest. So getting into some of the examples that I want to share with you. In South Africa, the banking industry, under the auspices of SABRIC, that's where I'm from, created a voluntary banking industry cert about 10 years ago. And we're working very closely with our National Cyber Hub on several initiatives, one being to educate the public on good cyber hygiene. And this is very important, because in our research, the organized criminals globally are targeting the user of the device rather than the corporate. They expect the corporate to have quite robust strategies and measures in place, and see the user of the device as the vulnerable individual. They are also the first line of defense when it comes to using the greater infrastructure, because often that is the backdoor through which threats actually get into a system. We're also working with the Cyber Hub to address the skills deficit in our country. Cybersecurity has not really been recognized previously as a profession, so we're working very hard at doing that and developing career paths with practitioners, consulting the academics and working with tertiary institutions. In my experience, there's quite a lot of postgraduate courses available within our jurisdiction, and the lacuna seems to be at the training for opportunities for entry-level cybersecurity practitioners that will make them job ready. So that's the area that we would like to focus on. And a very nice example to share with everybody on this webinar is that one of our banks has actually established an internal cyber academy. And what they're doing is they're upskilling staff who are at the risk of becoming redundant because of technological advancements, and they are turning them into cybersecurity warriors, which I think is an absolutely awesome idea. And then in closing, a last example of what can be done that I want to leave with you is a flagship example that we've managed to achieve, again, under the auspices of SABRIC, in partnership between the banks and law enforcement in South Africa. And this relates to support rendered to the police by rendering digital forensic analytical services to them and assisting them to analyze digital artifacts that are seized in their criminal investigations, especially complex financial investigations, analyzing the devices and then obviously being available to testify in their cases, as well as using the intelligence within this partnership to again send back into business as a crime prevention a tool. The turnaround time is usually very quick, and the evidence and the devices are processed before first court appearance. And those of you who are close to law enforcement would know what a boost that is for for any criminal, prosecution if you already have this level of information prior to the bail application. So I think within the partnership between law enforcement, or between the private and public sector, there are probably many more win-win examples of how we can collaborate and literally strengthen the resilience in any jurisdiction. Very happy to take questions if there are any, and I'm going to leave the thoughts that I want to share with you at that.
All right, I want to shift the tone a little bit here and start talking more about cybersecurity, and particularly peace and security. There, as Susan mentioned, there are a lot of bad actors out there, both criminal as well as others, who are exploiting vulnerabilities in the technology, and also users' own ability to defend themselves, because it's a very complex technology and almost impossible to stay ahead of it. So we have two people who are going to talk about this, excellent speakers. Karen Allen, the Senior Research Advisor and Head of Emerging Threats at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. And of course, everyone knows Mokhtar Yadali, Head of the Department of Information Society for the African Union Commission. So Karen, you want to kick it off here with some brief opening observations, and then we'll go to questions after Mokhtar speaks. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you very much, and esteemed colleagues, lovely to meet you all virtually, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Of course, you'd be hard-pressed to find a government speech in South Africa, or indeed across Southern Africa, without reference to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We've heard it already earlier on today. And of course, the developmental possibilities of the digital revolution are, by common consent, absolutely enormous. Professor Greenwald's spoken eloquently about the digital divide and new forms of publics who consume digital technologies. And of course, we have to be aware that in this part of the world, there are still huge gaps between the numbers of people who have access to the internet and those who don't. At the moment in South Africa, we're talking about 36.5 million internet users in South Africa alone. It's about a 3% increase every year. Mobile phone connections, about 103.5 million. But of course, we have to be aware that there are large numbers of people that don't have access to that. But of course, to be able to maximize the capabilities and be able to harness the enormous potential of new digital technologies, we need to be able to mitigate against the risks that threaten African peace and security. For me, one of the biggest risks is actually in defining cyber vulnerabilities too narrowly, and also defining potential threat actors too narrowly. The definition of who is and who is not a criminal or an accessory to a cybercrime is being muddled in this area, where access to technology is being democratized. The threats may be coming from state actors, their proxies, network criminal gangs, so-called hacktivists, or so-called digital vigilantes on social media. Or each of these players may play a role at a particular moment in time. Sometimes they may be exacerbating the threat. They may not even be knowing that they are doing it. So let's just quickly dwell on what do we talk about when we talk about cybercrime. Well, much of the focus has been on network intrusions. It's of course one of the biggest threats, especially here in South Africa, where cyber attacks on prominent hospitals, municipal government, credit agencies like Experian, and also banks are the ones that really make it into the news. And South Africa is clearly a target because of its developed financial services sector, and the threat to financial infrastructure and to critical infrastructure is obvious. So within this sector, we've heard Suzanne from SAPRIC talking about the way they're trying to respond to mitigating such risks, working alongside, for instance, the Cyber Hub and other industry bodies to try to share good practice and leverage private sector expertise to set up threat mitigation and response mechanisms. You know, we talk about certs, and there's much more space for collaboration in this space. But what else do we mean by cybercrime? Well, our policymakers and our publics perhaps need to work a little harder to think of cyber as an ecosystem. I like the word also attack surface that Suzanne used just a moment ago. I'm using the word ecosystem because it has both possibilities and perils where both good and bad stuff happens, rather than simply a computer with a set of components that can be meddled with. That's to say cyber-dependent crime. So we need to think beyond that. Within that ecosystem, we need to think of vulnerabilities, for instance, in the growth area of, for example, biometric surveillance, delivered not only by AI-enhanced network CCTV cameras gathering information along our streets or in our shopping centres based on our face, our behaviour, our gait, but also centralised government biometric databases such as the ABIS system, the Automatic Biometric Identification System, which South Africa's Home Affairs Department is due to bring in online. It's described as one point of truth. And in many ways, it makes a lot of sense to be able to centralise data, important data, in one place. But it's highly sensitive information about us, and similar systems in countries like Kenya have been halted in the face of legal challenges about inadequate safeguards. And we probably have to prepare for the same here in this part of the world and in other countries in Southern Africa. What are the potential cyber risks then associated with biometric technologies here? Well, the big one, of course, is algorithmic bias. We've seen what's happened in the United States with flawed facial recognition systems, which disproportionately target people of colour. That doesn't simply run the risk of criminalising disproportionately, but algorithmic biases can result in social sorting, determining who gets access, for instance, to vital government welfare services or aid and who doesn't. People, if they don't have the right paperwork, do they find that the machine simply says no? Another potential harm is, of course, the cyber harms, the risk that our data is stolen. Centralized databases make a lot of sense, as I've said, in terms of convenience and standardization across governments. But it also represents one potential point of failure. So if intruders are able to hack into the system, it's very easy to be able to get that information, get a lot of information and build a picture up and be able to use that, for example, to enact other types of cybercrime. For example, frauds or also deep fakes. We've all heard about that. The other possibility, of course, is function creep. Again, I'm talking about the biometric space. It's increasingly being seen as a vulnerability, whereas a database which is set up for one purpose, for example, authentication, then gets repurposed for another use for which it wasn't originally intended, potentially without the safeguards and potentially without the oversight mechanism. It might be used, for instance, to identify potential criminals or political dissidents, or those who present a threat to the status quo. So we need to start thinking about what mechanisms are available for auditing the algorithms and the vast databases that are being gathered. And at what point does a service which is meant to authenticate a person's identity across a variety of different biometric markers become securitized and a tool of state surveillance? Now, in countries like South Africa, where civil society is strong, these questions are already being raised. But in countries where executive oversight is weak, particularly in emerging democracies, function creep really is one of the biggest threats. There's also the threat that bulk surveillance becomes a norm, potentially challenging democratic institutions. I think also when we talk about cyber threats and this ecosystem that I referred to, we also need to think about information operations and social media platforms and the potential for data to be stolen, but also the ability of social media platforms to shape agendas for nefarious purposes. Think of attempts, for example, to meddle in elections, which we've seen in South Africa, in Kenya, and Madagascar, using social media networks. And in work that we're about to publish at ISS, we've been observing the weaponization of social media platforms to mobilize and activate real-world consequences on touchstone issues, such as anti-foreigner or nationalist xenophobic sentiment, which can have real-world consequences. It's called digital vigilantism. It's a contested term, but because of the amplification effect of social media platforms, it does have the potential to provide an online audience for extremist actors in a way that they may not simply have in the real world. For example, one hashtag related to this nationalist agenda in South Africa, which was called Put South Africa First, which it pushed those extreme narratives. It was very prominent during the COVID-19 pandemic and reached some 48 million Twitter users during that window between January and May this year. We've seen acts of digital vigilantism in the era of COVID-19 with Chinese nationals, for example, blamed for spreading the virus, being hunted down as part of a doxing attempt. We've also seen other targeted individuals having their personal identifiable information put online, exposing them to potential cyber harms such as identity theft. Now, this may not seem like a threat to peace and security, but imagine if a malevolent actor wants to initiate a highly organized hate campaign to sow divisions and confusion and to undermine traditional law enforcement mechanisms in the same way that we've seen attempts to try and undermine electoral processes. And you realize how potent these new tools can be. Navigating this for policymakers, of course, is a difficult balancing act, as some of the other speakers have talked about, between the right to freedom of expression and protecting a person's privacy. Cyberspace, the risks becoming the theatre where the battle of the mind, the battle of shared values and norms becomes contested. Finally, on threats, I want to very briefly mention, and I do say very briefly, this is the issue of drone technology and unmanned aerial systems, because they're frequently part of a network and thus they're exposed to intrusion and by extension cyber threats. You know, whilst in this part of the world we are seeing drone technology being used to help overcome some of the developmental challenges, particularly, for example, in the delivery of blood samples over vast areas or helping farmers monitor their crops, the ability for violent state actors to weaponize drones has to be on our radar, no pun intended. They could be used to deliver traditional weapons or explosives. I worked in Iraq in 2016 and saw firsthand that this was happening. But they could also be used as a form of delivery of a cyber attack. There's a lot of work being done by this. It's still in its infancy. If anyone's interested, there's a fascinating paper that the RAND Corporation has just published on this. So very briefly, what's being done to improve cybersecurity in this part of the world, or to rather mitigate the risks of cyber crime, because the two things in South Africa are seen as very separate. We've got a draft of legislation coming on stream. We've got the Cyber Crimes Bill, which is about to be enacted in South Africa. It doesn't have cybersecurity component within it because the decision was made to split the two issues, but it does lay the groundwork by identifying crimes, penalties, and threat mitigation measures. It looks specifically at cybercrime, as I say, not cybersecurity, but we can probably expect to see a cybersecurity bill in future. In South Africa, we've also got the Protection of Personal Information Act, POPIA, which gets fully operational next year. This pretty much mirrors the 8 internationally recognized data protection principles, including the collection, the use, and storage of personal data. But there are gaping holes. If I put my data, my personal data, on a social media platform, or I get duped into doing this, I'm not necessarily protected from the act. As a regional leader, South Africa is already heavily involved in a number of UN and other high-level regional initiatives to establish norms, and Dr. Mukhtar, I think, will talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. But as I see it at the moment, the biggest challenge is enforcement, capacity, capacitating our regulators with the resources and the know-how to do the job, upskilling the police and public prosecutors about the threat landscape, protecting and promoting digital literacy among ordinary people like you and me, knowing that if they have a digital device with a link on it, they don't just click it, with the risk that they could be exposing themselves and others to viruses. But, you know, Susanna's made a very good point. Why would someone want to take, for example, updates, software updates on their mobile phone, if it's a choice between using their valuable data and the money to purchase data, or be able to buy an extra meal for the family? Those need to be addressed. And also encouraging more public-private sector working. I think one of the things that finally I want to make the point is that I think the African continent needs to be very wary of opening itself up to the imposition of surveillance norms and other cyber norms, which may run contrary to democratic principles, when countries which perhaps don't share the same norms are able to usurp this space. We're going to be reliant for quite some time on other countries being able to help to build capacity coming from China, from the United States, from Israel. In fact, some scholars are talking about a technology arms race. And this strikes me as the perfect platform and the perfect part of the world for that arms race could actually to be played off. So when we talk about things like data and data security, I think policymakers here and educators on the ground need to make people aware that African data is a valuable commodity. It's no longer just gold, it's no longer just oil. we need to be able to find ways of protecting our data and make sure that in a trade-off for receiving infrastructure, for receiving some of the underlying help in putting the network foundations, if you like, upon which we develop our cyber universe here, we don't engage in difficult trade-offs, which mean that we surrender African data to countries. And we're seeing this in countries like Zimbabwe, where some trade-offs are being made. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's quite a conversation. I would say, you know, there's a lot of contradictions here. We have to upskill the police, but be careful not to have too much surveillance. So a lot of contradictions to deal with within the broad panorama that you painted. All righty, great. Mokhtar, the floor is yours. Please keep, I must ask the speakers to keep their remarks somewhat briefer. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And it is really hard to follow all these great speakers that have spoken. And by the way, just I wanted to make all their comments and speeches mine, because basically they have said all I wanted to say. Now, I will be a little bit diplomatically provocative, if you may allow me, Bruce, and feel free to cut me at any point of time. And in order to put some safeguard, I will just resume at the beginning the key messages I wanted to convey through my intervention. Number one is, the key message number one I wanted to convey, that digital transformation is a requirement for the survival and in the same time is a geopolitical challenge for Africa. Number two, the economy and interest of the future is the race for data collection. Number three, we are living in the new geopolitical contexts of what we call the Cold War 2.0, if I may say. Number four, the African leadership need to act swiftly in order to avoid what's so-called the digital colonization, and specifically in enhancing the capacity and reducing the cybersecurity knowledge gap among the African leadership. Number five, I wanted just to conclude by saying that the objective of the African Union is, in one hand, the ratification of the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity, Electronic Transaction, and Personal Data Protection, and in the same time, having each and every African country adopting a cybersecurity strategy, adopting a cyber legislations, and in the same time establishing computer emergency incident response team, CERT and CERT. So these are the major messages I wanted to convey. And now that I'm just explaining what I wanted to say exactly, and feel free to cut me at any point of time if you think that I'm going over time. Now, as I was saying, the digital transformation is extremely rich in opportunities for Africa. Whether we call it daily and we want it, it will happen anyway, no matter what. And all sectors will be actually affected by the digitalization. But it is the greatest opportunity for us to look at our development in a different way by talking about e-education, e-health, e-agriculture, etc., etc. The second point is the economy and threat of the future, as I was saying, is the data collection. And African leadership must know that the industry of the future and for the next 24 years is artificial intelligence, advanced life science, development of algorithm for human behavior manipulation, very important, currency codification, cybersecurity, and big data, specifically, I will insist on the data issue. Indeed, data has become the geography of the future markets that will allow geopolitics and geoeconomics expansions. You must own them at all costs. You must master them. Any information is good to collect, and by all means, the leitmotif of everyone today is everything that is technically feasible must be achieved, whether this achievement is judged morally good or reprehensible. People just collect data, no matter what. Now, following the end of the wars and the Cold Wars between the ideological blocs in the 21st century was supposed to be entering into an era of peace and prosperity, but the ambition of China, Russia, and other emerging powers have changed that. while the European Union is looking for a new positioning, specifically in finding alliances with Africa and fighting the what's so-called the GAFAMs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, the United States and Russia are seeking to counterbalance their strategic retreats, respectively by absolute domination of the economy of the internet and the development of IT tools for destabilizations among themselves. A new Cold War 2.0 surfaces with the new tools of destabilization based on cyber warfare, and states are losing more and more powers. And increasingly, the computer networks are actually being owned by those big companies that are actually dominating the internet in general. The economy of digital platform, people have spoken about it, are gradually establishing itself as a dominant economic model. Different type of players are evolving around this new digital economy. Data centers, manufacturers, all those people are actually racing to see how much they can control that. Almost all these actors are non-Africans. All those digital platform providers are non-Africans at all. And they are all motivated by profits.
Mukhtar, I'm going to stop you.
Yes, I was expecting that to happen. Just give me 2 minutes to say that in order for Africans to avoid this digital colonization, they must act. They must act by really taking all those safeguards that has been mentioned by Karen, mentioned by other previous speakers, that we need really to make sure that Africa is part of the game and are putting the safeguard to protect itself. I was actually very smart by putting my key notes at the beginning. Thank you very much.
You were an example. We should all follow that. That's great. Thank you so much for that. But the reason I wanted to stop you there is because because it leads right into the next conversation, which we're going to have about governance. And I'm going to consolidate the discussion for both the two topics, this crime and cybercrime topic with the governance one, in order to save a little time. And now in the topic of international governance with all the various actors that you and Karen put out there and laid out on the screen as multiple players, both private and public sector. I want to invite Ambassador Jaarsma from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands to give his remarks, and then Advocate Mashabne from the South African representative of the UN group of the governmental experts to follow her. The floor is yours, Nathalie.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And dear participants, all protocol observed, thank you all for joining. It gives me great pleasure to be part of this exciting and challenging conference on a crucial topic for our future. A conference which was initiated during the South Africa and Netherlands joint coordinating committee meeting in February of this year between our two ministers of foreign affairs, Minister Pandor from the Republic of South Africa and Minister Blok of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has been an early adopter of digital technologies, enabling us to become a leading digital nation. Through our experience, we have seen the positive effects of digitalization on our economic growth and development. And in fact, I used to work for the industry and I've seen all the benefits. The Netherlands and South Africa are already collaborating in digital projects. The Dutch Bureau of Statistics and the cities of Tshwane, Johannesburg and Cape Town work together on big data management for the development of resilient and sustainable cities. Now, we know there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and therefore we are excited to work with South Africa and the Southern African region to share best practices to bridge the digital divide and exploit the enormous developmental potential of cyberspace. There is, however, an important precondition for reaping the economic and societal benefits of cyberspace, and that is trust between governments and citizens, between companies and citizens, and between companies and governments, both locally as well as on an international level. Trust is key to maintain an open, free, and secure cyberspace. We all trust the digital solutions that enable us to meet each other today. At the same time, our lives both online and offline, are at risk of being disrupted by cyber attacks and cybercrime. Every malicious cyber operation by state and non-state actors alike erodes trust. Now, I could talk much more about all the different ways in which trust is eroded in cyberspace, but I would rather walk on the sunny side of the street and further build on the trust and consensus that already exists. I would like to highlight 3 lines of action that contribute to building trust: multilateral norm development, international cooperation to counter cybercrime, and capacity building efforts. First, the strengthening of the existing international normative framework and its implementation is a Dutch priority. We can already look back at major achievements, such as the work of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, an inclusive multi-stakeholder project which proposed norms for responsible behavior online. And we have seen concrete and broadly supported outcomes of UN processes, such as the 2015 consensus report of the UN Group of Governmental Experts. It is now widely acknowledged that international law in its entirety does in fact apply in cyberspace. From here, the way forward is to jointly get to an understanding on how international law applies in cyberspace and how we can better implement the norms of responsible behavior. This includes how to hold actors accountable through attribution and other diplomatic responses. At the UN level, the international community works on a shared understanding of the rules of the road in cyberspace. Since 2018, the UN Group of Governmental Experts and the Open-Ended Working Group work alongside each other on these issues. We recognize that each of those initiatives has its own merits, yet they aim at tackling similar issues which can create redundancies. Without preempting the upcoming outcomes of either the GGE or the OEWG, the Netherlands, together with many other states, fully supports the joint proposal made by France and Egypt to establish a program of action. Such a program of action can enable us to work in a long-term, inclusive and progress-oriented format. The Open-Ended Working Group will have the opportunity to discuss this and perhaps other proposals during its session on a regular institutional dialogue early December. Secondly, we need to cooperate internationally to counter cybercrime and improve the digital resilience of our citizens and companies, especially as states digitalize and economies rely more and more on digital means. The Netherlands believes in the value of exchanges of technical knowledge and best practices for operational entities to investigate and prosecute cybercrime. We commend the important work of the International Expert Group to conduct study of cybercrime, chaired by South Africa, and we look forward to its stock-taking exercise in 2021. The International Expert Group is a primary forum for a comprehensive exchange of best practices between states whose work we would like to continue beyond 2021. The Netherlands is a party to the Budapest Convention, a comprehensive treaty on cybercrime, which is already ratified by 65 states globally. We acknowledge that many states in the UN see the need to negotiate a new multilateral cybercrime treaty in the ad hoc committee process. It is important that a new treaty builds on the expertise and experience of existing international instruments. We want to constructively engage with all of you to jointly agree on an ad hoc committee process that is based on inclusivity, transparency, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. In order to avoid further international divisions, the process should be guided by consensus. This conference is only a starting point for our joint dialogue with the Southern African region on this issue. Thirdly, it is in our mutual interest to engage in capacity building. The gains of cyberspace are not equally distributed, as has been indicated by previous speakers. With 50% of the world population still having no access to the internet, there is a huge global connectivity gap. which has increased during the pandemic. When capacities of ICT security diverge too much among states, it can amplify vulnerability in an interconnected world. Moreover, by harnessing the potential of ICTs, progress across all 17 SDGs can be achieved, particularly on goals 9 and 10, to ensure a resilient infrastructure and reduce inequalities. In that light, the Netherlands took the initiative in 2015 to establish the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. Since then, it has matured into a strong and independent capacity building foundation. The Global Forum on Cyber Expertise brings together needs, resources, and expertise of public and private partners. It strengthens the institutional capacities and resilience of the more than 100 participating members and partners. And of course, we would very much welcome you all as a member state or a partner organization in the future. Do reach out to us if you would like to join, or to Chris Peter, who is also with us today. In a similar vein, we provide financial support to the Digital Development Partnership of the World Bank, especially in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And we engage in regular outreach discussions, such as this Global Cyber Policy Dialogue, co-organized by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the South African Department for International Cooperation and Development, EastWest Institute, and Research ICT Africa. We look forward to an in-person meeting in Southern Africa in 2021. In conclusion, the Netherlands is convinced that an inclusive, adaptive, multi-stakeholder effort at norm implementation, combating cybercrime, and capacity building contributes to creating a more reliable, secure, and trusted digital environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Excellent summary and very conciliatory remarks, I must say. So, Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think I identify a lot with what the previous speakers have raised, and also what Ambassador Jasma has just raised now in relation to the global processes dealing with cyber security and cybercrime. As we have mentioned, I'm currently the chair of the Intergovernmental Expert Group on the problem of cybercrime. And I can safely say that the experts have made abundantly clear that international cooperation to address cyber matters is very critical. So since this initiative was established, there's been an increased interest in working to resolve the challenges of cybercrime. Our position on the global governance of cybercrime has always been that we need to understand each other. The states have to understand what they have and what they don't have, and why the global study on cybercrime from the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice was so important. And the subsequent steps taken thereafter, not to immediately come up with a solution to the gaps, but to discuss how we can address those gaps, looking at what we have and what we don't have. That has been the most gratifying part of chairing the process for some times now. We are a few months away from doing a stock-taking session in 2021, and I'm proud of the work that member states have achieved so far. The chapters in terms of the report that focuses on electronic evidence and criminal justice, law enforcement and investigations, the prevention and criminalization, have helped us to understand the extent of this global challenge. It is encouraging to see that out of the 53 African states, about 16 have cyber crime strategies or frameworks, and we all agree on key principles of international cooperation, public-private partnership, rule of law, harmonization, accountability, multi-stakeholder approach, and governance. As we dovetail these processes with one starting in the UN General Assembly's Third Committee, in keeping with South Africa's track record of promoting the peaceful resolution of conflicts and focusing on commonalities than differences, we are committed to promoting truly transparent, inclusive, and non-discriminatory negotiations that establishes a universal instrument to commence in 2021. I've come to appreciate that cybercrime is just as important as the international cyber policy. In the context of the global group of experts, and the open-ended working group of the UN, in which we are discussing emerging and existing threats, confidence building measures, capacity building, norms and principles of responsible state behavior and international law. It is just as important to have transparent conversation at a regional and sub-regional level. And it is very important that the African Union is participating in this process. And we hope that there will be further engagement with our sub-regional group, SADC as well, looking at what we currently have, but also looking at efforts to increase the ratification of the African Union Convention on Cyber Security. The threat of destruction of critical infrastructure by malicious attack by state-sponsored actors is a real threat, and we need to build resilience and capacity in that area. We are cautiously optimistic that positive outcomes will be achieved that will take the 2015 Group of Governmental Experts report and process forward. I agree with Ambassador Natalie Jasma, and that the approach that promotes cybersecurity as a societal and economic enabler is what we should be adopting. It starts not with just designing cybersecurity from a threat-centric lens, but looking at the highest ambitions we have, those of economic benefits, social prosperity, resilience, and safe ICT environment, cost reduction, national security, and international influence. So as far as our view is concerned, that the UN is very critical as a center of gravity on all matters of global concern. So when it comes to norms, it is very important that the UN plays a leading role in discussing new norms that seek to close any lacuna or gap in international law. But we have to be very open that cybersecurity and cyber crime is a global phenomenon that can only be resolved through collective international cooperation with the UN as a center of gravity. I thank you, Bruce.
Thank you as well. You have an unenviable task, Enrico, of wrapping up a little bit here. We're running a little long, so I appreciate people if you're able to stick around for another 10 minutes or so, that's great. Otherwise, thank you for coming. The floor is yours, Enrico.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this, I would say, compelling regional cyber policy dialogue. And greetings from the beautiful city of Cape Town that I placed in my background. I hope we won't distract you, but anyhow, we are almost at the end of this. So as Bruce said, I have this difficult task of summarize these really engaging and interesting discussions that I think they were on inclusiveness, equity, safety and security, and resilience. And I'll try to reflect upon them to identify some of the main takeaways that we can reflect upon after this meeting. Okay, if we go through the program, Ambassador Molloy, in his introductory remark, okay, he elaborated, of course, on the fact that these three pillars of the conference, which are sustainable development, peace and security, and governance, are interrelated. And from a South African perspective, the use of ICTs has to try to overcome some of the main challenges that the country is facing, that are poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So the reality is that we cannot have digitalization or achieve the expected benefits of the fourth industrial revolution and sustainable development if we do not address these issues and their interconnectedness. Ambassador Molloy also stressed that we cannot leave behind in terms of connectivity, and also other speakers actually talked about that. But at the same time, access, of course, has to be safe and secure for everyone, respecting individual rights of privacy. It was mentioned by a number of speakers. And the role of governance should be to develop rules so that cyber risks and threats are ameliorated and reduced. Criminal activities online are stopped and persecuted according to the rule of law, while the individual and human rights are protected. Subsequently, Alison Gilwald mentioned that to provide security as a global and strategic public good, global governance mechanisms need to be devised so that policy and rules how to protect users online and how to preserve stability and peace in cyberspace can really be effective. This issue of, in this interconnected and complex nature of cyberspace was mentioned by a number of speakers that really requires these joint efforts by all these actors that today were represented during this global dialogue and regional dialogue, the governments, private sector, civil society, and technical community. They all are called to address the different challenges that they face. And these stakeholders also are called to recognize that they've got specific responsibilities to maintain an open, free, secure, and safe cyberspace. Afterwards, Esther Muema, she represented a perspective from civil society organizations. She delved into issues of sustainable development and ICT, stressing the point that the pandemic has actually hit harder on the most vulnerable and marginalized. So from a gender perspective, which is one of her expertise, which looks at unequal distribution of power, at grassroots issues, at digital inequalities, as more women are engaging online, online harassment, cyberbullying, and other forms of harms, gender-based violence are also growing. So Esther highlighted that there are a number of disparities that still exist between urban and rural areas, and that the young people in rural areas are particularly affected by lockdown rules, considering that they cannot attend schooling any longer. So there are a number of gaps in terms of access, as we have seen. So there is a gender gap, there is a rural-urban gap, and there are ICT skills gap. And those are both, should be addressed both from a supply, they've got both supply side challenges, including lack of infrastructure investment, concentration of big platforms, problems related to spectrum allocation and high cost to communicate, and demand side challenges, which are linked to affordability, to socioeconomic disparities. And social policy are really needed to improve access, and they not only need to be devised, but also implemented, which has been observed as actually a challenge from a developing country perspective. We have also highlighted the issue of the digital policy paradox mentioned by Alison, so that as more people actually are connected and can access more information and services, digital inequalities, the realities that are amplified, not reduced. And this is not only the case between those that are online and offline, as suggested by the digital divide policy discourse, but also in terms of security gap between those that are actually have got the skills and the capacity to identify, understand cyber risks and threats online, and those instead that do not have the resources in terms of skills, means, and capabilities to be actually aware of cyber skills. That's a point that was also addressed by Susan Portigier. She pointed out also on the importance of devising collaborative mechanisms between private sector, non-for-profit, academia, and civil society, to improve resilience, not only at the regional level, but actually globally. And in terms of sustainable development, she stressed that COVID-19 and technology has been somehow an opportunity for development as well. ICT have been extensively used for education purposes, only for those, of course, that could afford it. And to provide continuity in education. But the technology has also provided financial inclusion. She also mentioned that example. But she asked to reflect upon how actually the public and private sector can work together to develop cybersecurity standards that promote access and use on the one hand and respect privacy of people while keeping them safe and secure online. So there is a need somehow of striking the balance between, the cost of compliance that is up to the private sector and be resilient. And how can we achieve this through these collaborative mechanisms? To achieve that, capacity building is needed at all levels, starting from the user's level, because educating users on digital safety and security is actually the first line of defense. In the second panel on peace and security, the presenter focused on critical vulnerabilities that threaten peace and security, both from a technical and societal point of view, and on how Southern African countries can actually improve cybersecurity. Karen Allen stressed the importance of looking at cyber vulnerabilities and cyber attacks from a broader perspective, so beyond somehow the narrow definition of IT and network security. She mentioned, issues of data theft and data intrusion and surveillance that are threatening the African population, creating tension between security and privacy. Also, the increasing, reliance of disruptive technologies, but also social media platforms have an impact on people privacy and security. And these together with, as I mentioned, disruptive technologies, for instance, face recognition systems, digital IDs, and artificial intelligence, raise concern on the fact that personal identifiable information can either reach the public domain without consent or can be used for harmful and criminal purposes. And Karen provided a few examples. So there are some harmful elements of connectivity and increasing digitalizations. And they need always to be considered together with the impact that the use of these disruptive technologies of the fourth industrial revolution has on people's rights, on cyber policy making, and on enforcement, for instance. Mokhtar, he focused his intervention on a provocative one. He wanted to be diplomatically provocative. So the digital transformation strategy in Africa is a geopolitical challenge, he mentioned. Of course, we know that ICT is expected to enable and empower African people if access and use of technology is safe and secure, but African leadership need to act swiftly against this trend of digital colonization. So, the objective of the AU has been to support the ratification of the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. Has been one of the main efforts of the African Union. And more recently, there have been also multilateral discussions on disarmament, peace, and security in cyberspace, which is also something that Mokhtar Mashabane mentioned in his intervention. And the importance of cyber confidence building was actually emphasized last year during a meeting that was held at the African Union in the context of the UN GGE and open-ended working group. So institutional arrangements for dialogue and implementation, together with the need of building a more robust capacity and delivery system, are really needed from an African perspective. The two final interventions by Nathalie Jarsma and Dr. Mashabane address the issue of governance of cyberspace, discussing what are the specific ways in which the UN and other international and regional processes can support peace and security. So we try to answer two questions, then what is responsible state behavior in cyberspace? And do we need the UN, the governmental group of experts, the Global Commission on Cyber Stability, and the open-ended working group? And for what purposes? The intergovernmental group of experts studying the issue of cybercrime. Nathalie mentioned that there are difficulties around building inclusiveness and consensus and building trust. She mentioned the issue of trust, and that has got repercussion on how to fight cybercrime in a collaborative efforts and at all levels. So vertically from the regional, from the national, regional up to the global, and horizontally in a multi-stakeholder way, which includes collaborative efforts between all these different stakeholders. It was mentioned that the Budapest Convention is a workable document which inspired a number of cyber legislations across the world and also in the region, but it seems that it falls falls short in terms of inclusiveness. So, some processes was suggested should be guided by consensus, inclusiveness, adaptive multi-stakeholder effort. And regarding cyber capacity building, questions are linked then to how to deal with these different challenges and threats. And the GFC was mentioned as an important forum to really bring all together and globally needs, resources, and expertise of the public sector, civil society organizations, and private sector to really build capacity. Our last speaker, Dr. Mashabane, also somehow built on the issue of, on how to build trust in this area, mentioning the important work of the intergovernmental group of experts on cybercrime and the fact that South Africa is chairing that group. So in this context somehow of tension and distrust, the UN offers opportunities of international cooperation, of collaboration, to solve some of the problems of cybercrime. And I think that this can also be achieved actually through bilateral dialogues. For instance, this one, that was between, two governments, the South African government and the Netherlands, and in a multi-stakeholder way, inviting a number of stakeholders. Discussing issues pertaining sustainable development, peace and security, and governance of cyberspace. So it's an effort that does not require only the participation of the public sector, but of all these actors. And Dr. Mashabane mentioned also that it's important to identify commonalities, but also differences that countries, have in this space, and understand what are, the specificity at the regional and at the country national level. And in this space, the UN plays this very critical role as a center of gravity to build global consensus. So. To conclude, I would like actually to thank the people who worked very hard for this dialogue to happen today. We had so many participants from almost all Southern African countries and beyond. And this regional dialogue is a teamwork and collaborative effort, which is in practice between different countries, regions, and stakeholder groups. I won't be able, unfortunately, to mention everybody, and we are actually a very group of people. But a special thank goes to Lunga Bengu and his team at DIRCO, to Bruce McConnell and his team at EastWest Institute, and to Ian Husken and Emma Bweke and their team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. It's been really a pleasure for me to have worked closely with you all. And of course, a big thank to all of you, the participants, for your attention and valuable contributions to this dialogue. Thank you. And Bruce, microphone is yours.
Excellent job, Enrico. That was amazing. We can just take your notes and turn them into the meeting summary. So awesome. Thank you all for coming. Special thanks to the speakers for spending an hour and a half, over almost 2 hours with us. And in your busy schedules and in everybody's busy schedule, thank you very much for our co-sponsors, the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands and South Africa. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event, hopefully in person next year, and online, if not then before that. Thank you all.